the real reason you never bring your ideas to life. Have you ever noticed how some ideas feel alive inside your head, full of energy, purpose, and potential impact, yet they never make it into the real world? They stay trapped between expectation, attachment, and the fear of failing. Time keeps passing, and the ego keeps inventing sophisticated excuses for procrastination. What's curious is this: the more you idealize the idea, the farther actual execution seems to get. Hey, race the truth. And this is where the necessary discomfort begins. The problem is rarely a lack of talent, creativity, or ability. Most of the time, the block comes from too much control, from over-idealization, and from confusing identity with creation. The idea stops being something you do and becomes something you are. And when that happens, self-sabotage takes over completely. In this content, we're going to dismantle that process. With clarity, courage, and a bit of improvisation, you'll understand why your ideas aren't stuck by accident, how detachment changes everything, and why taking action, even in uncertainty, activates a butterfly effect far bigger than you imagine. This is not about perfection. It's about creative responsibility, trust, and action. Attachment to ideas and the ego. Attachment to ideas often disguises itself as care. But underneath, it's fear of losing control. When the ego steps in, creation stops being light and turns into an identity test. The idea can't fail, because if it fails, it feels like you failed, and that's what freezes everything. This is where fear of failure blends with expectation and idealization. The mind starts demanding the perfect scenario, the ideal timing, absolute confidence. The result? Elegant procrastination, the kind that looks like planning, but is really just self-sabotage wearing nice clothes. Creation asks for detachment from the very beginning. Ideas need room to fail, to adapt, to take shape in the real world. When you loosen the grip of the ego and accept the process, clarity emerges, action flows, and courage begins to replace fear. That's when something bigger becomes possible. Fear of failure comes from excessive attachment to idealization, control, and outcomes. When you cling too tightly to the final result, everything before it feels insufficient. The mind creates a perfect version of the idea and then rejects every step that doesn't live up to that expectation. Control becomes a desperate attempt to avoid mistakes, but it ends up suffocating action instead. This fear of failure doesn't come from reality. It comes from idealization. You haven't even started yet, and you're already predicting criticism, rejection, and worst-case scenarios. The ego loves this game because as long as you're overplanning, you don't have to expose yourself, and you don't have to take responsibility. In practice, creating means trusting the process and accepting uncertainty as part of the path. The final result is not something you reach all at once. It's built through action, through improvisation, and constant adjustment. When you release control, creation starts moving, and something unlocks inside you. The ego paralyzes action when an idea becomes too perfect to fail. When an idea is placed on a pedestal, it stops being a project and becomes a symbol of your personal worth. The ego whispers, it's only worth acting if it's flawless, extraordinary, worthy of immediate applause. And ironically, the more perfect the idea becomes, the less it moves. This pursuit of perfection creates an invisible cycle of procrastination and self-sabotage. You revise, adjust, refine, yet you never feel ready. Fear of failure disguises itself as care, while action is always postponed, waiting for a confidence that only comes after you start. In reality, clarity doesn't come before action. It shows up during the process. Ideas gain strength when they touch the real world, not when they stay protected inside your head. By accepting imperfection, you weaken the ego and strengthen creation, making room for courage, learning, and movement. Focusing only on the final outcome blocks progress step by step. When all your attention is on the final outcome, every small step feels insignificant. The mind compares now to an idealized future, and decides it's not worth acting yet. That mental leap creates anxiety, feeds fear of failure, and reinforces procrastination. The creative process doesn't work like an on-off switch. It happens in layers, adjustments, and attempts that, on their own, seem too small to matter. But it's precisely this accumulation of action that builds clarity, creative identity, and trust in your own path. One simple practice helps a lot. Break the idea into micro-actions you can execute today. Write one page. Test a prototype. Share a rough version. When you honor the process, the result stops being pressure and becomes a consequence. The inability to deal with improvisation and uncertainty freezes projects and dreams. Try to predict everything before starting is a classic control trap. Creation rarely follows the script we imagine, and when the mind demands total security, it blocks action. Improvisation and uncertainty are not enemies. They're natural parts of the process. Many projects die not because of lack of ideas, but because of intolerance for the unexpected. Any deviation from the plan feels like failure, feeding fear and self-sabotage. The ego would rather not act at all than adapt in public. In practice, creating is a conversation with the world, not a monologue. You act, observe the response, adjust, and continue. The sooner you accept uncertainty, the lighter the path becomes, and the more space opens up for creativity, courage, and real learning. Locking ideas away is denying your creative purpose. When you guard an idea like a state secret, something gets lost along the way. Attachment turns creation into ego protection, not purpose expression. Creativity stops flowing and becomes a silent weight. Often, holding back is an attempt to preserve identity. If I don't show it, no one can criticize it. But that protection comes at a high cost. Frustration, a sense of stagnation, and the feeling that you're always owing something to yourself. Creation asks for calculated risk, not isolation. Sharing doesn't take power away. It activates impact. When you release the need for absolute control, something bigger starts moving, and you begin to see why control, in the end, is an illusion. Control is an illusion. We grow up believing that if we plan enough, we can avoid mistakes. But in creation, total control is a comfortable fantasy, and a limiting one. Life, projects, and ideas will always slip through our fingers a little, no matter how tightly the ego holds on. Excessive control comes from fear of failure and the need to guarantee a specific outcome. But the more you try to dominate every variable, the less room there is for improvisation, creativity, and unexpected discovery. The process becomes rigid, and action stalls. When you accept that you don't control everything, something interesting happens. Relief. Tension turns into presence. Rigidity turns into curiosity. And that openness prepares you to recognize that something bigger is operating alongside you. There is something greater than the individual God, universe, energy. At some point in the creative journey, it becomes hard to deny that something greater is at work. Call it God, the universe, energy, or the intelligence of life itself. The name matters less than the experience. Ideas arise. Connections happen. Doors open in ways human control could never explain. When you try to do everything alone, the ego takes the wheel, and the weight increases. But when you acknowledge a greater force, creation becomes a partnership, not a struggle. Faith enters as trust in the process, not passive waiting, and responsibility remains the same. To act. This perspective doesn't take credit away from you. It gives your role meaning. You do your part with clarity and courage, and allow the rest to organize along the way. And that leads to an even more freeing realization about the control we never truly had. Ideas need to be tested. An idea that is never tested lives only in imagination. In the real world, it needs friction, people, mistakes, and response. Testing doesn't diminish an idea. It strengthens it, refines it, reveals what actually works. Treating ideas as hypotheses changes everything. You launch, observe, collect feedback, and adjust. This cycle removes the weight of perfection and shifts focus to continuous learning, reducing fear of failure and self-sabotage. In practice, this can be simple. Publish a draft, validate with a few people, create a low-cost prototype. The sooner you test, the faster clarity arrives, and the more natural the next step becomes. Now tell me honestly, how many ideas have you left behind because of fear, attachment, or excessive control? How many times did procrastination disguise itself as planning, and the ego convinced you to wait for the perfect moment? Maybe the real failure was never making mistakes, but not acting. Creating means taking responsibility for what comes to you. It means trusting that, even without total clarity, action generates learning, impact, and a butterfly effect. When you release idealization, practice detachment, and honor the process, something greater starts moving. Creation gives back meaning, purpose, and identity. Not because it worked, but because it was lived. So raise the invitation. Which idea is asking to come through right now? What can you do today, small and imperfect, to bring it into the world? If this content brought you clarity, courage, or even discomfort, that's a sign it worked. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following along. There's still a lot of creation, communication, and impact waiting to happen.